So I've been contacting various other trans rights activists and trans rights groups. If I haven't contacted you yet, it's because you're not real and you're fake and you can fuck off. No, it's because I haven't contacted everyone, but I do want to talk to loads of people and see where we are as a community, particularly in the UK, but further afield too, and see what we can do to change things. Because whatever has been going on isn't necessarily working. I do think that in one sense we're up against like an impossible enemy. Like um, the the thing opposing trans rights is like the international fascist conservative billionaire class. Uh, the richest, loudest, most powerful people on earth are all made hating trans people one of their like top three things. Like J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, like multiple leaders of governments, Vladimir Putin, um, Viktor Orban, like loads of people. And so, in one sense, what we do doesn't matter that much because we're so outgunned. But on the other hand, I do feel like there is more stuff we can do in terms of like campaigning and our strategy as a community and what things we focus our effort on and how we organize. Um, and so I have been discussing about like creating a central source for like trans rights articles and um, evidence and papers and stuff. That is on the back burner. I'm still thinking about that. Still making very slow progress, and still fully intend to do something along those lines. But another thing that I've been thinking about, and I just had a meeting about, was the idea of taking more, or just more in general, media things. And I know we talked a bit before in a previous episode about taking more hostile media gigs, but also more positive ones, but mainly thinking about the strategy for taking them. And what I was thinking was, like, the gender critical movement has a lot of resources. They have people who are full time gender critical anti-trans campaigners. Like the people at Sex Matters get like unlimited funding. Their entire career is like trying to take away trans people's rights, and there are very few people on our side in that position. So they get training from like the global right wing, like lobbying groups and stuff. I mean, this isn't like a conspiracy theory or anything. These right wing groups, these like Tufton Street groups, do get media training. They get like strategy meetings and pick their lines and stuff. And although the gender critical movement as a whole is very ridiculous and conspiracy theory minded, they still do have some core arguments that they use. It's why, like, you know, all of this Donald Trump stuff is saying the exact same phrases as like Mayor Forstater and stuff have been saying for the last 10 years about defending biological sex, and you know it's all the same stuff, and it's because it's their lines that they've decided work. And I think that although their arguments and their ideology are garbage, and when you like look at them they just fall apart and they're internally contradictory and they're not based on evidence, they're working as propaganda. And I think we're relying on the evidence and facts and things, which is good that that's on our side. Well, it's good we're on the side of that. Like, I think if the facts weren't on our side, we'd be on the wrong side. But I feel like we can do a better job on the propaganda front too, because the gender criticals are very good at it. And here, not propaganda doesn't mean like Soviet style lying for the government. I mean, getting your message across and engaging with media, not just the legacy media, but social media and all kinds of different things. I just don't think our messaging is super great at the moment, and our strategies and stuff of we shouldn't have to debate this. Like, there's a common thing you'd hear for the last like 15 years is like we shouldn't have to debate trans rights. Like, people's rights aren't up for debate, and like, yep, totally agree. We should not have to debate people's human rights. But we are, and now the most powerful people on earth are going out of their way to eradicate our rights, and they're using arguments from the gender critical movement So we've got to do it. Like, that's the sad reality of it. And if you don't want to do it, then, well, kind of tough. But if you can't do it, I mean, as we've talked about, arguing isn't the only thing you can do for trans rights. Watch the previous video on that. There's loads of stuff you can do. Do what you're good at. But when it comes to a media strategy or a strategy for the trans rights movement or for pushing forwards the momentum that we need to build up, I think we just need to not have that as a core thing. Like, if you feel like this is bullshit, I shouldn't have to debate my rights. Like, I totally agree with you. You should not have to debate your rights. And that's not just true for trans people. That's true for like disabled people and, you know, immigrants and women who need abortions and all kinds of things. But the reality is that we're like, trans people are like number 2 on the fascist target list after immigrants at the moment. Or around, you know, in the top 5 topics they talk about. So we just have to. And another thing is, like, when you're engaged with some of these arguments, I think sometimes people are almost expecting some kind of implied respect for all parties involved in the discussion. And so when someone says something disgusting about trans people, like just says that all trans people are pedophiles or something, sometimes I feel like some people's response is to, like, did you hear what they just said? That's so rude. Like, they can't get away with this. And the thing is, they can, and they will, and they don't give a fuck. The baseline here is they don't even think you're fully human. They have no respect for you at all. And half the audience doesn't either. And so relying on some kind of respect, assumed implied respect, like as if you were a human like everyone else, it's not a real strategy. It doesn't work. A good example of this recently is the congresswoman in the USA, Nancy Mace. She said a slur for trans people, just like on the floor, and they said, like, you shouldn't say that. Like, you'll get in trouble for saying that. So she just said it a load more times, like on purpose, to make a stand against trans people or whatever. And then the response from like the left, the Democrats or whatever, was just like, oh, that's a bit rude, like the decorum, or like just mumbled about politeness and offended, and it's just bullshit. Like, no one gives a fuck if you're offended, full stop. But if you're a trans person, it's not they don't give a fuck that you're offended. Some people's dedicated, that their only fucking hobby is trying to offend trans people. Like, if you say this is offensive to trans people, who cares? No one cares. No one gives a shit. The people listening on the radio don't know anything about trans people. They don't care. So we need to just cut in on the argument instead. And that doesn't mean to just accept the dehumanization. Point it out. Absolutely. This person is dehumanizing, and they would never say that to anyone else. But also what they've said is factually untrue, and it's tied into a larger conspiracy theory about LGBT people, which is now centuries old. Like, that is a way better pushback. You've just got to expect them to say something not offensive. You've got to expect them to treat you like you're less than an animal. And that is just the reality of engaging with the gender critical movement and the far right and stuff. But anyway, all these kinds of things, like the last 2 things I mentioned, I think there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Like, actually, another one I will say is, I think a lot of, probably most people consider themselves generally supportive of trans rights, but they don't really know anything about it. And if you push them to argue on it, they would just not really know what to say. And they might sometimes want to speak up and say something. And then a gender critical person might say something like, well, you can't change biological sex, and men are more likely to be violent sex offenders, so therefore I don't think we should have trans women in the toilets. And if you don't know what's going on, you might think, well, what argument have they made here? You're like, oh, I can't say anything about biological sex. I don't know about biology. Okay, I'll just concede that point. Okay, you can't change sex. And then, well, men are more violent, so I'll just concede that point. And then suddenly the whole gender critical argument is just, you've conceded to it. So the only thing you have to say back is, well, I think that trans people are valid. It's like, okay, cool. Yeah, I think trans people are valid too. But that's completely meaningless in the face of someone saying, well, because of biology and because of sexual assault, we've got to do this. And so we need to teach people what argument to actually make in response to this. To say, actually, that isn't how biology works at all. That is factually false. Secondly, men aren't biologically sexual predators. It's how society raises men to be. And there's no evidence that trans women are sexual predators more than anyone else. And they're way more likely to be the targets of sexual harassment. And also, removing trans people's human rights doesn't actually affect sexual predators at all. Like, they're all good arguments against this thing, but most people don't really know to make these. So what I think we need to do is, as a movement, come up with a better strategy. Things like, okay, the reality is we have to take on some of this bullshit argument. Whether we want to or not, we're in a position where we absolutely have to. Like, we're in full on, like, you know, backs to the wall, time to do something mode in a lot of places in the world. Secondly, I think we never want to never implicitly accept anything. Don't ever accept dehumanization. Don't ever accept implied premises which don't go addressed, but also expect them to not respect you as a person, expect the moderator in any debate to instantly side up with this insane conspiracy theorist, bigoted lunatic just because they're both cis people and they've got more solidarity for cis people than they have for what's true. And just accept that's the reality of the battlefield. And now we need to carve out what the good lines are. We know what's true. We know that the trans rights position is the position you'd reach to if you skeptically analysed the data and rational arguments, starting from the premise that we want to minimise harm to people and maximise well-being. But that's a big mouthful, and, you know, walking through some of this is difficult. So we need, like, good lines to counter the gender-critical ones, which are good slogans based on nothing. And we can, like, because we have the evidence and the facts and the rational arguments behind us, we can do better than them. I mean, they've got to rely on biological sex is binary and immutable, which is false, and it's a core premise their thing. So we should be able to come up with slogans and stuff that make people realize this is rubbish, counter it, get rid of their implied premises, and get to the point. And then so we can go on media things. If you get a chance, like, maybe you're watching this and you're like, oh, maybe I want to go on the radio and whatever. We want people to know the situation they're going to be flung into and how to respond well. And you might only get 1 minute. And if some wacky conspiracy theorist loser comes on and says, like, Big Pharma invented trans kids so they could cut off trans children's genitals, you've got to be like, okay, I actually knew they were going to say this because they all believe this. No one cares if I act offended, so I'm not going to bother. And I need to cut in with something along the lines of, this is a ridiculous conspiracy theory which has no evidence for it at all. Trans people are unable to reach access to healthcare across the country, across the world, which leads to massively higher rates of depression and self-harm, etc. There's no evidence that trans healthcare is harmful at all. There is decades of evidence that trans healthcare is helpful. And in principle, the government shouldn't be able to override what experts and scientists internationally are saying is best for trans people. Like, just slam it in 30 seconds. Then they'll be like, cool, thanks, person. We'll see you again. And then they'll just cut off end of the show. That kind of thing. You know, you need to be able to just slam through the talking points. So, yeah. I think that's something I'm going to be involved with, is seeing what we can do to help people with that. This is a watch this space. Something's happening. But if you are good at this, contact me. Or if you're good at this and you're like, I fucking hate KT, I don't know why I even clicked on this video, but she is right in this occasion, go and do your own thing. And just, that's cool as well. But yeah, that's what I think we need to do. Just been seeing what chat has been saying about this. Personally, as a cis ally, I've taken time to educate myself, but realistically, most people aren't as politically engaged as me. Yes, absolutely. Like, 99% of cis people do not give a fuck. But what we need to feed them is a clear, short understanding of why the gender critical position is wrong. And to make them know that, like, the extremes, the stuff they're kind of vaguely hearing about that's happening in, like, the USA and Russia and stuff about trans people is insane. It is extreme. It is really horrific, like, really grim. And they, the arguments they're using for this are absolutely terrible, biologically false, factually false. They're just completely making stuff up. And it's really dark. And it could come here and it could affect someone because they don't just do it to trans people. And then people will be like, oh, so you're saying the Trump administration is wrong about biology? Yes, the entire gender critical movement is just factually wrong. Even if you don't like trans people, now you know the argument you're hearing is factually wrong. And they'll be like, okay, yeah, well, trans people are disgusting, but, I do want to be correct about science. And then they'll go away and they'll think about it and they'll be like, oh, actually, yeah, I don't. That's the kind of, we need to correct people on all of the assumptions that people are making, not just trans people are human. Someone saying here, one media training thing I learned was the 3 Ps. Always have your punches, memorable lines, proof, evidence and stats, and progress. What does that mean and what do we do next? Yeah, that is really... I've never had official media training, as maybe you can tell. But that is basically the conclusion I've come to. You've always got to think they're going to try and throw me off. They're going to, if you're against someone, they're going to gish gallop. They're going to make stuff up. They're going to make insane logical leaps that don't make sense at all. So you've got to be ready to, firstly, just absorb that they've just said that and you have to respond to it in 1 second. That's fine. They're going to say some off-the-wall bullshit. They're going to make things up. Then you need to, annihilate it quickly. That is just factually false. And then bring it on to the reality of it and do this, like, punches and evidence. I can't remember what the P was. Proof. Say, actually, this is factually false because the international medical community thinks that sex isn't binary and it's actually made up of all your sex characteristics and lots of them immutable. The evidence is the following societies agree with me. And then what that means is we cannot create a system where there is only 2 labels because it just doesn't work for thousands of people. I think that's a good summary. Someone's saying here, people talk about trans people being a new thing. I've known for over 20 years. I've known that transgender was a thing for over 30 years. But God, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing that's so easy to drop into a fact thing. Like, they'll be like, we're seeing these new things and now you're supposed to treat a man like a woman or whatever. That's just so easy to just crush in a discussion and be like, what they just said was wrong. Trans people have actually been around for centuries and we've got evidence from it from, like, the Victorian era. Trans women have been using women's toilets in the UK, legally protected to do so since 1999. So, any talk of removing this would be an experiment. Or would bring us closer to Saudi Arabia's view of gender or something. Which is, a better argument than saying, oh, actually, trans people are valid and we should respect all trans people. And what I found that they just said was actually quite rude and offensive. No one cares. No one gives a fuck.